From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. The last of U.S. forces leave Afghanistan, ending a 20-year presence. The longest U.S. war saw the death of 306,294 people, including 6,294 American soldiers and contractors. The final American flight left Kabul airport a day earlier than projected. The Taliban, who fought the U.S., declared victory and are in full control of the Kabul airport. 5 rockets fired from Kabul airport. The rockets were fired through a modified car with an improvised launcher system. No damage was reported. The attack came a day after a U.S. drone blew up a vehicle headed for the airport that American officials say was carrying several suicide bombers. This attack killed 10 civilians in the car next to it. 8 children and 2 adults died as a result. This happened a mile from Kabul airport, which is a densely populated area. A neighbor told the Washington Post that the family was living a normal life and were not involved in militant activities. Taliban senior leader Abdul Haq Wasik criticized the U.S. drone attack. He said that the U.S. military's airstrikes in Afghanistan are contrary to last year's Doha deal signed by the U.S. and the Taliban. U.S. Representative Sarah Jacobs warned Congress and President Joe Biden against responding to the deadly attack with more war and violence. She said, if we don't, we will have learned nothing from the last 20 years. The U.S. and the Taliban have not attacked each other in a year. President Biden on Sunday participated in a solemn ritual over the remains of fallen U.S. troops. In addition to the 13 American service members, more than 160 Afghans died in a bombing at Kabul airport last Thursday. ISIS Khorasan took responsibility for those attacks. As the 2-decade-long U.S. occupation draws to an end, the U.S. has evacuated 116,700 people from Afghanistan since August 14th. Flights are now primarily focused on getting U.S. troops out. The United States announced Sunday that an agreement has been reached with the Taliban to get Afghan allies out of the country after the August 31st withdrawal deadline. The U.S. will continue issuing travel documents to designated Afghans so they can travel to their respective countries. The declaration came after Shayer Senakzai, the Taliban's lead negotiator, on Friday said in a national broadcast that it is every Afghan's right to travel abroad. However, he added that they should travel with the dignity appropriate to an Afghan and a Muslim. The U.S. and the Taliban have recently begun cooperating in ways unheard of in the past. They have been engaged in peace negotiations since 2013 before signing an agreement in February 2020. However, last week, ISIS Khorasan's attack at Kabul airport has strengthened cooperation. This is especially to ensure security at the airport that was unthinkable 2 weeks ago when chaos during the evacuation process reigned. On Saturday, Taliban fighters escorted a steady stream of Afghans from buses to the main passenger terminal, handing them over to U.S. forces for evacuation. After a 20-year war, the Taliban and American forces, otherwise enemies, were within open sight of each other, separated by just 30 meters. Zalmay Khalilzad, special U.S. envoy for Afghan peace, welcomed the Taliban statement. He tweeted that the statement is positive. We are allies, and the international community will hold them to these commitments. The Afghanistan war has now ended, but a Cold War has begun. More details in this report by Saleha Farouk.
The longest war in American history is over now. But is it really over? A Cold War is already hot between the Taliban and the USA. America has frozen 9.5 billion of Afghan reserves. The International Monetary Fund has blocked 370 million. The World Bank is not behind either. It has frozen 800 million. What will happen to the Afghan people? The United States has airlifted 120,000 of its allies from Afghanistan. That leaves 39,821,121 Afghans behind as of August 30th, 2021. What is their future? 6,294 American service members and contractors were killed in this war. But the Physicians for Social Responsibility say 220,000 Afghans died as a result of the war in the first 12 years. In addition, 80,000 Pakistanis died as well. The total financial cost to the United States is estimated to be $2.3 trillion, according to Brown University. U.S. soldiers are out of Afghanistan now, but it's the cost of the 20-year war that will be $6.5 trillion by 2050. In the meantime, Afghans are waiting. They are waiting outside the banks, in line, waiting to leave Afghanistan, taking a flight or crossing the border into Pakistan. United Nations is in the meantime warning others. The UN food chief believes Afghanistan is marching towards starvation. Now, is it the Taliban who must lift their people out of poverty?
Banks are finally open in Afghanistan after being closed for 13 days. Afghanistan's central bank has ordered all private and international banks to limit withdrawal to their individual customers to $200 per week. The Taliban has appointed Mohammad Idris to head the Afghanistan Bank. He served as a finance lead for the Taliban, but has no banking experience. Ajmal Ahmadi, the former governor of the central bank, fled the country a day ahead of the Taliban's entry into Kabul. The United States has frozen $10 billion of Afghan U.S. reserves. Afghanistan is dependent on international aid money, which accounts for 75% of public spending in the country. The International Monetary Fund has refused to disperse $400 million due to the Taliban. The World Bank has also followed suit. China and Russia, in the meantime, are using this as an opportunity. They have pledged to help the Taliban rebuild Afghanistan. Several mosques in Maryland and Virginia are collecting supplies and donations for Afghan refugees arriving in the Washington, D.C. area. Dar al-Nur Masjid in Manassas, Virginia has 400 volunteers ready to help. 3 Maryland mosques and Islamic organizations, including the Maryland branch of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, are receiving supplies and donations. In Virginia, the Mustafa Center in Annandale has begun requesting people to stop bringing supplies since they've run out of storage space. About 14,000 refugees from Afghanistan have arrived at Virginia's Dulles International Airport in the past 12 days. Up to 5,000 will be housed at the Marine Corps base, Quantico. A large number are currently being housed at the Dulles Expo Center. Local faith and community leaders are, however, concerned about conditions at the Dulles Expo Center. They say that the federal government has refused aid or supplies from outside nonprofit groups. Mosques in California, Missouri, New York, and Minnesota are also preparing to support arriving refugees from Afghanistan. More than 1 million homes and businesses in Louisiana and about 67,000 in Mississippi are without power after Hurricane Ida hit yesterday. Ida packed winds of 150 miles an hour and is expected to dump up to 2 feet of rain as it lumbers north. President Joe Biden met with governors and mayors from states and cities impacted by Hurricane Ida. He approved a disaster declaration for Louisiana. The storm has now been downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical storm. Ida, on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, was responsible for at least 1 death. Nassau, New York, police are looking for the man who threw urine and garbage at the front door of a mosque in Hicksville. Surveillance video from the Faizan-e Aisha Mosque shows him walking up to the front door of the masjid twice to do so. The incident happened on August 13th. The mosque, however, did not report it to police until Thursday. This was after the same man returned and threatened worshippers. The Muslim community is worried that this is the beginning of another wave of Islamophobia, which threatened the entire Muslim community post 9/11. One of America's leading private business schools has established an institute in honor of Edible Arrangements founder Tariq Farid. In Massachusetts, Babson College will focus on empowering other franchisees and business owners to expand and boost their success. The institute, funded in part by a gift from business tycoon Farid and his family. Edible Arrangements is a US-based franchising business. It combines the concept of a fruit basket with designs inspired by flower arrangements. Its substantial growth to over 1,000 locations worldwide was due to aggressive franchising. In 2018, Farid was inducted into the International Franchise Association Hall of Fame. He's a Pakistani-American Muslim who came to the US as a child. Farid views franchising as a means for others to create their own legacies. In international news today, members of Hindu militia Bajrang Dal burnt a copy of the Kama Sutra outside a bookstore in the city of Ahmedabad in India. They also threatened to burn down the bookstore if it did not remove the book. The Hindutva militia says that the book shows Hindu deities in vulgar positions. Kama Sutra is the most celebrated treatise on intimacy around the world. It was compiled in the 4th century by a Brahmin religious scholar named Vatsyayana. Bajrang Dal is a member of the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, or RSS. This is an Indian right-wing Hindu nationalist paramilitary organization whose members form the current Indian government. It has committed violence against Christians, Muslims, and secularists. In 1999, members of Bajrang Dal burned to death an Australian missionary and his 2 sons. The Wall Street Journal last December reported that Facebook has not cracked down on the group as it might endanger its business prospects in India. It has also refrained from bringing any action because of the security of its staff in India. Zambia's new president pledged Sunday that under his rule, government critics will be safe from state persecution. Hakainde Hichilema beat his predecessor, Edgar Lungu, of the Patriotic Front in the country's August 12th general election. Hichilema said that his United Party for National Development Alliance government would not muzzle any citizen on trumped-up or politically motivated charges. He himself was arrested 15 times as an opposition leader, including in 2017 on treason charges. The new president said poverty, hunger, joblessness, and a lack of business opportunities for his people were more his enemies than those perceived to be political enemies. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. In one of our previous in-depth analysis segments, we talked about what people in the US think about the country's foreign policy. Let's watch some of the excerpts from that segment.
Thank you and much appreciated. Today we're very happy to be joined by Dr. Gordon Adams, who is a professor emeritus of the United States Foreign Policy, as well as from the American University in Washington. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. I wanted to first start off by asking you that since the Trump presidency, which has perhaps changed the way many people might regard US federal leadership when it comes to events abroad, Republicans are feeling a little bit less certain about the country's national interests in other countries. Talk to us about this potential shift in thinking regarding events abroad as they relate to foreign policy.
Well, there's been a very interesting shift in the last 4 years, partly through the Trump presidency. He's probably the first president that the United States has had in a long time whose general view of foreign policy was very, very nationalistic, very America first, very opposed to multilateral cooperation, very uncertain about remaining in alliances, very unwelcoming of U.S. military forces applied abroad, prepared to withdraw forces from countries in the region, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So you had, while he was a very idiosyncratic and unpredictable president, he was also somebody who broadened the scope of the discussion of foreign policy in the United States to include talking about a different kind of U.S. presence overseas, a different set of alliance relationships, a withdrawal from cooperation. It was a most unusual presidency in that regard. And what has happened now is that because Donald Trump continues to have an influence on the Republican Party in the United States, the Republican Party has begun to adopt some, not all, of the precepts that seem to become clear through the years of the Trump presidency about not cooperating with allies, emphasizing U.S. military strength, U.S. Unilateralism, cooperation, even intimacy with Russia, areas of foreign policy which were most unexpected. So we now have a rather deep split, I would say, between the most Republican voters and most Democratic Party voters with respect to what are the important issues and how should the United States engage the world.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about multilateralism. Given the United States' divide on governments' multilateral priorities, to what extent do you believe that public opinion might affect the outcome of decisions made when it comes to the direction of foreign policy?
Here's the thing about foreign policy and American elections. American elections, the Americans are a rather insular population. They don't focus a lot of time and attention on things that are happening overseas, which means most American elections don't turn on foreign policy issues. It's the rare election that does. Those come second. Vietnam may be said to have had an impact on the 1968 presidential election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. 1980, maybe, when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, who was running for his second term. But what is most compelling about foreign policy issues in American elections is not the policies themselves. Those rarely determine elections, but how the public views the reputation of the United States overseas and the capability of the person running for office to actually be a strong leader. Strong leadership is the one area which does seem to play an important role. John Kerry learned that in 2004 to his disadvantage, because the Republicans successfully pointed out that his service in Vietnam was uncertain and boastful and not what he claimed it to be. That suggested that he was a weak leader, not that Vietnam policy was wrong, but that he was potentially a weak leader. It was inaccurate, but it was effective, which often happens in American elections. So I don't see the Republican view right now as determining policy so much as it will lay a background for elections in terms of people seeing somebody as a symbol of strength. And that's the one thing that Donald Trump apparently conveyed, was that he was very strong. It doesn't follow what policies would happen, but that he was very strong.
Turning our attention a little bit about media portrayal. Now, when it comes to people falling into what's called a media bubble, to what extent are outside events or other critical points of view perhaps excluded from being able to help people make an informed decision about foreign policy decisions? And if you could tell us about the potential impact of this in American society.
Yes, you do find, and I think this is a new development in American politics, including domestic policy as well as foreign, and that is that this is now a very divided nation. And it's not only divided because people have different points of view, but it's divided because the media are now divided themselves. There was an interesting Pew poll last month that basically said Republicans tend to follow things like Fox News, radio commentators like the late Rush Limbaugh. The Democrats tend to follow sources like the network television, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. These sources tend to be sources that are read by people to the left of the political spectrum. What that means is we're really seeing now dispensed two completely divergent views of America in the world, American foreign policy, also domestic policy. And there is no balance in those views on either side, really. CNN and the New York Times, I would argue, retain a certain amount of balance. But even there's been increasing reluctance to display what is sometimes called fake news from the right of the American media spectrum. So now the big media sources are competing with each other and focusing on their audience, not on a general audience. I come from the generation that used to watch the evening news, which was pretty fair, balanced stuff. I find myself almost incapable of consuming what's on television today among those sources because you're no longer viewing news, you're viewing opinion. What that means, I think, is it tends to drive the Americans in a more insular direction. The left views the world with important issues like climate change and pandemics and international cooperation as being an important place for the United States. The right tends to view things like military strength and anti-immigration as driving their views of the foreign policy of the United States, and they don't talk to each other. And the media don't talk to each other either. So what you're seeing is this polarization of the American media spectrum, which only reinforces the polarization in American society and American politics. It's not educating the American people anymore, it's dividing them.
Now, you mentioned the recent Pew poll that came out. In your professional opinion in general, what kind of social or perhaps economic factors might lead American audiences to regard government foreign policy focus areas in either one direction or another? I know that you touched a little bit about those factors, but in a more generalized sense.
The audiences that watch these different sets of media, some very right and some middle to left, are very different people as well. And this, the Pew poll did not focus on so much. It would have been interesting if they had. It would have been interesting to see what the ethnic diversity breakdown was of the people that they polled amongst the Republicans and amongst the Democrats. I rather suspect, but I haven't seen their raw data, so I don't know if they collected it. I rather suspect that the Republicans tended to be older, more male and white, and the Democrats tended to be younger, more ethnically mixed, and more representative of the gender distribution of American society. Pew didn't offer us how those differences in ethnicity and sociological standing and economic standing affect the views that are there, but other polling suggests that by and large, the older the voter is, the more they are white, the more they are male, and the less they have a college education, the more they are likely to take views that emphasize military strength, follow the leader, strong men, a view of the world that is very, if you will, Hobbesian. And the audience that views these media on the center to the left of the political spectrum tend to favor international cooperation, tend to favor working with allies, tend to favor the view that we can't really solve a lot of the world's problems through military force or by the US alone, tend to focus on things like climate change and health issues. In other words, they're more likely to be on that end of the policy spectrum as well. Geographically, that just divides the country basically in most states. You have states that tend to be CNN, New York Times, MSNBC viewers, and you have states, principally South, Midwest, who tend to be Fox News, Rush Limbaugh viewers, and they are divided from each other. And what's critical here is that there's no arena, because the parties now in Washington reflect that division. There's no arena in which those can be compromised.
Thank you for that insight. Now, the same Pew Research recently revealed that the majority of Americans are feeling a little bit more confident in Biden's handling as his foreign policy term begins. Now, especially in this fragile transitional period for American leadership, what do you make of that?
That is a little bit too early to tell. Biden hasn't yet encountered the kind of pushback and problem that all presidents encounter. He has the huge advantage of being non-Trump. He is calm, he's collected, he thinks through policy issues, he gives his staff a lot of leeway. You don't see the kind of turmoil in Washington that we saw for 4 years under the Trump administration. All of that tends to convey to most American people, but again, media is divided here, the view that this is a steady hand at the till. And you can expect him to reason things through and to work problems through. The biggest issues for Biden, of course, are domestic policy issues. If his vaccine strategy succeeds, if the economy begins to return to normal, if employment begins to tick upwards, all of those are going to be more determinative of his foreign policy than anything else directly involved in foreign policy. There were two things in the Pew poll, however, that I found quite interesting. And that was the point where both the Fox, Rush Limbaugh viewers and the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC viewers agreed. Quite interesting. One was on the importance of jobs, and that emphasizes what I talked about earlier. Everybody on both sides of the political spectrum places a very high priority on creating employment and restoring the health of the American economy. So if Biden succeeds, he stands the possibility of gaining support. The other thing they agreed on is somewhat more disturbing, and that is viewing China as the principal adversary or the enemy of the United States. On the far right, the watchers of Fox and radio broadcasters use the word enemy to describe China. And that's been reinforced, I think, sadly, by the Biden administration, because they too have portrayed China as the principal adversary of the United States, as the country that needs to be contained, as the country that needs to be dealt with, as the country around which we have to focus military planning. In other words, both sides have been kind of putting out a message that China is the focus of U.S. foreign policy and it's an adversarial relationship. That does not bode well for our relationship with China, nor for the understanding of the American people about the sophistication with which China approaches the world. But it is now confrontational and, interestingly enough, on both sides of the political spectrum.
Dr. Gordon Adams, Professor Emeritus of United States Foreign Policy at the American University in Washington, as well as non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington, in light of the new Pew Research report. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3.
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the current situation in Afghanistan, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed analysis. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. By now, United States have airlifted, evacuated, whatever term would you like to use, 120,000 people from Kabul. At the same time, it is struggling with ISIS-K while Taliban are cooperating. At this moment, the question is, 120,000 are airlifted. What about the rest of the 38 million Afghans who are there? What's happening with them? There are lines outside the bank. What is going on? How is life over there? To discuss that with us is someone who is an Afghan American, who is an IT professional, but deeply involved in what goes on in Afghanistan. We have Tawab Hamidi for Virginia. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Walaikum assalam, Brother Malik Mujahid, and thank you for having me.
To tell us what is happening with people in Kabul.
Well, thank you for hosting me and raising awareness to the issues of Afghan and the plight. So in my discussions with various people on the ground, they've echoed that they've got some level of peace and security now, but the bigger challenge is their finance. The banks are closed. The institutions, well, they recently opened, but with very limited access. You can only take out $200 in a 24-hour period, and that's only if you're lucky enough to be able to get in line early enough, and then they close the banks early on. And then they've got financial inflation, which is continuously keeps going up. You've got 25 to 30% easily inflation of basic commodities. And additionally, the Afghan Central Bank reserves of 10 billion was frozen by the US as soon as the Taliban came in. The IMF froze $450 million that were scheduled last week to be sent to Afghanistan. The World Bank has frozen financial support. All remittance is completely stopped. And then before the collapse of the previous government officials and elite took out as much money as they could and took it out of the country. So the bank was basically left impoverished, and a lot of people who held their money in the bank can no longer access it or have any financial transactions. And then in addition to this, the World Health Organization had scheduled 500 tons of much needed medicine that was due to arrive last week or in the past few weeks. But because the airport has now been prioritized to take all these other Afghans out, they can't ship those medications or medicine, and the hospitals are running out. So I hope that gives you a glimpse of what's happening on the ground.
Well, tell me this. You mentioned that people who are leaving, they are taking the money out?
In the past 6 months or past 8 months, or I would even say as going back to 2018, the elite in Afghanistan has been taking out money from the banks, and whatever money they had, whatever investments they had, they've basically move their money out of Afghanistan. And in addition, there are reports prior to leaving, members of the Ghani government, people who are attached, they also took whatever money was remaining out before they left. It's as if, given that, I guess, given their concern with the rapid speed that the Taliban was taking over the country, in the past few months, there was an excessive outbound remittance of money. So that further left the banks in a desperate situation.
So Taliban, who have been running a whole campaign for 20 years of guerrilla warfare, they somehow have been funding themselves. So now they have a responsibility of not only funding themselves, but funding the whole rest of the people. Afghanistan being 75 to 80% dependent on the foreign aid, what are the prospects if IMF is blocking, United States has blocked the money, if the World Bank has blocked the money, are there some other avenues available for them to run the government? Because 38 million people need some sort of money moving. I mean, of course, Afghans are an old-time trader. They were the chiefs of the Silk Road. So trade probably will be one of the things, but the type of international dependence on they have, how they will be able to restore confidence in the world so their money is open up back to them.
There are lots of sources, but in order to be able to leverage those sources, you still need to be able to conduct financial transactions internationally through the financial institutions. So recently, the Taliban announced in Kandahar that to all the farmers who were growing poppies that they can no longer grow poppies, that they should, cease growing poppies. And then the price of poppies increased to 400. There was an increase of poppies to about 400%. Now, the concern that many people have is that this is going to lead to a lot of transactions that are not necessarily recognized, and a lot of like primitive, basic level types of transactions. And additionally, there's at least concern among certain Afghan circles that they may end up making deals with China, which will, and China has been very open arms about the Taliban in the past year or so. They may end up making deals solely with China, which may end up having Afghanistan be completely in the sphere of China economically. And at that point, it may be too late for the U.S. to use financial incentives as a bargaining chip.
You're thinking all the ban by America freezing the assets and the IMF and World Bank going along is essentially a bargaining chip?
Absolutely. There are numerous news media, and even the G7 has stated, members of the G7, that they're using this as a means to ensure that the new government that they're planning to set up has members or includes certain members. I recently read an article where they want individuals like Ahmad Massoud, Amrullah Saleh, Atta Mohammad Noor, and maybe others back in this new government, which will probably be a point of contention.
So the agreement which Taliban and America signed in February 2020, does that include all that type of provisions?
When I read that agreement, no. I don't think anybody expected the Taliban to basically take over the way they did. I think the plan, from what I can tell, the February 2020 deal did not include any of such measures, But what it did include is that they were supposed to engage with the Afghan government and create a new interim government. And that was based on Anthony Blinken's also proposal back in April. He actually put forth a proposal to the Afghan government of creating an interim government where Ghani would have had to give up power, but they completely refused it, and that's when basically a peaceful solution between the two warring factions died out.
The conversation got a bit about new Taliban and the old Taliban, Taliban 2.0. What is your reading? Are they same Taliban who denied education to girls, or these are different people?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's not part of human nature to stay the same. Ideologically, I think they're the same in the sense that their focus is that they want Sharia, they want Islamic ideology is the same. But as far as their approach, from what we can see based on just the past few weeks, there's significant changes. One, they declared amnesty for everybody. And while some people don't necessarily believe them, there are incidents that one can point to that makes it more believable. The case I have is Ismail Khan from Herat. He surrendered, and then he basically worked with the Taliban and trying to create peace between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance, or some sort of a transition. And then he was free to leave, and he left and went to Iran. So they didn't necessarily held him captive. And then even in Kabul, from what I've been told, they're not engaging people in any harsh manner. The regular Afghans, I find women newscasters who are not even properly, like according to the hijab dress code, are not 100% in hijab, but they still have not done anything, and they're continuously doing their work. And they've declared themselves that, to all the Afghans, that please continue on with your daily job. The schools were closed for a period of time, but now they're starting to reopen. They opened K through 6, and then the plan was to open the rest. I just heard yesterday that the Ministry of Education was announced something, but I'm not sure of the details. But their objective is that, one, have a mahram when you're going out and make sure you have the proper dress attire. There are numerous YouTubers, famous YouTubers, that I still see going around in Kabul who are female, who are going around interviewing people, but their dress code has changed. So I do have hope that there is change, and they will not take a brute force approach to the people. But there is fear amongst certain groups, and that fear was also amplified in the past at least 8 months or 9 months by the government as a means to leverage the people to fight against the Taliban.
So is that the reason that ISIS Khorasan or ISIS-K is in an interview told a CNN lady who was going around in Kabul that ISIS are no longer, the Taliban are no longer firmly on Islam. So are they, is ISIS-K defining itself the true holders of the Islamic extremism, as Taliban moving more towards the center and moderation?
So in the Afghan community, the biggest challenge that Afghans have is that when it comes to ISIS or ISIS-K, these people do not have an address. nobody knows who they are. There's not a single scholar or alim that defends them, or can anybody can say that this guy is an ISIS-K or used to be a scholar and he left and joined ISIS-K. It's a bit it's an enigma for many Afghans because, ISIS-K was not, ISIS was never in Afghanistan to begin with, and then for them to have come into Afghanistan, to have the funding, to have the weapons, that's a bit of a there's a lot of there's a lot of concern amongst Afghans, and yes, there are definitely issues between the Taliban and ISIS-K. There were a few. When the Taliban took over Kabul, they basically, all the people who were in jail were released, at least especially political prisoners, with the exception of 9 ISIS fighters that were actually executed by the Taliban. So these kind of so ISIS is still an enigma for many Afghans, just because they don't have, there's nobody that leads them that people know of. They don't have an address, don't have a spokesperson that people can refer to. So we're still, in the dark.
So tell me this, are your relatives feeling safe in Afghanistan?
So I've spoken with multiple people. The people who were older, who were from the older generation, what I've noticed is that they do feel safe, meaning that they already experienced the Taliban in the 90s. They have some level of understanding of who these people are, and they know how to operate within them. So there are quite a few people that I've had that discussion and they feel safe. But on the flip side, there's a lot of youth that have never known the Taliban. They don't know the political history and the background in the past 20 years. They've only known the Taliban from whatever the government has told them about the Taliban. So they're terrified. They're more fearful and scared. And these are family, friends that I've spoken to. But fortunately, nothing has happened to any one of them. And they do say that for now, things are decent, but they're concerned, well, what's going to happen once the Americans leave? They're of the opinion that, nothing is happening because of the U.S. troops still being in Kabul. At least that was their take. But I think on another note, going back to your earlier point, the Taliban are, from everything I've read and seen, they're desperately keen on gaining legitimacy in the international world. Their declaration of amnesty, their leniency policies, making sure that they don't go for revenge and retaliation killing, I think it's all part of that objective of gaining legitimacy or recognition internationally. So that gives me some hope that there will be peace and security, continued peace and security. And then in the prior government, what many people don't realize is that kidnapping, looting, thieves with guns were fairly rampant. And all of that, from what people are telling me, has ceased completely.
So it is relatively claimeless while Taliban, you're saying, are in power. That's what your relatives are saying. But are some of your friends taking a flight to United States or trying to get into Pakistan?
I don't know of any specific, but I can definitely see that happening. The World Food Program, the executive director for World Food Program basically said that 1/3 of Afghans are marching towards starvation. And then a former UN official basically said that the Afghan economy is going to collapse unless the international community supports it financially. There were already a few 100,000 internally displaced people because of fighting this year. If the economic situation does not improve, regardless of whether the whole country is in peace and security, people are still going to leave because, and this is also going to give rise to, unfortunately, all kinds of terrible things such as child trafficking, taking basically abuses towards the vulnerable who tends to be refugees.
Thank you so much, Brother Tawab Hamidi from Virginia, an Afghan American IT professional, but interested in what's happening in home country.
Thank you, Brother Malik Mujahid, and to your audience.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.